A billionaire mistakenly enters a virgin's room. A few days later, he receives a strange phone call. The bus rumbled to a halt, the hiss of hydraulics jolting Carolyn Evans from her reverie. She clutched her worn leather satchel tighter, her fingers brushing the edges of her carefully folded notes. Beyond the window, Seattle unfurled like a restless animal. Glass towers piercing the grey sky, streets alive with hurried footsteps and the constant symphony of horns, chatter, and city life. It was nothing like Leavenworth's quiet hum of wind through pine trees or the subdued creak of its wooden bridges. Here, everything moved too fast, too loud, and far too large. "Next stop, Pike Street," the driver called. Carolyn adjusted her glasses and stood, her heart thudding against her ribs. This was it. Her first conference, her first real step into the world she'd dreamt about since she was a little girl, perched on her bed with a stack of marine biology books. Now, at 22, she wasn't just a reader, she was a presenter. The crowd at the conference hotel lobby was a kaleidoscope of professionals, each seemingly at ease in their roles. Lanyards dangled from necks, their bright conference badges identifying them as scientists, professors, and industry leaders. Carolyn's own badge felt too heavy around her neck, the bold presenter under her name, an almost cruel exaggeration. At the reception desk, a woman with a practiced smile handed Carolyn her room key. 15th floor. Elevators are to your left, she said. Enjoy your stay. Thank you, Carolyn murmured. Her voice barely carried above the din of heels clicking on marble floors and bursts of animated conversations. She tucked the key into her satchel and turned toward the elevators, her pulse quickening. The ride to the 15th floor was interminable. Each ding of the elevator doors opening felt like another chance to reconsider her presence here. When it finally stopped, she stepped out onto plush carpeting that muffled her tentative footsteps. The hallway stretched long and uniform, each door indistinguishable except for its bronze number plates. Room 1542. Inside, the room was pristine, a modern cocoon of neutral tones and soft lighting. Carolyn set her satchel down on the bed, pausing to let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her eyes wandered to the window, where the city's skyline framed the encroaching dusk. Distant lights flickered to life, a testament to the endless movement below. The sight was mesmerizing and terrifying, all at once. The next day, her presentation went smoother than she could have hoped. The conference room buzzed with muted approval as Carolyn walked off the stage, her hands gripping her notes tightly. Her nerves hadn't unraveled until the final question was answered, and now a wave of relief washed over her, leaving her limbs feeling lighter. Evans. A cheerful voice cut through the crowd. One of her colleagues, a man with bright eyes and an easy smile, waved her over. That was Stella. You're coming to the after-party, right? Oh, I don't think... she began, but her voice faltered as another colleague chimed in. Come on, Carolyn. It's tradition. First presentation deserves a toast. The word tradition seemed to weigh more than it should, nudging at the part of her that longed to belong, to be more than the quiet observer she'd always been. I suppose. One drink couldn't hurt, she relented, her voice almost too soft to hear. The restaurant was warm and crowded, its air thick with the mingling scents of grilled salmon and rosemary. Carolyn sat at the edge of the group, her hands wrapped tightly around a glass of water. The others were animated. Stories of field expeditions, academic rivalries, and the latest breakthroughs flew across the table like a well-practiced tennis match. Carolyn, right? One of them asked. Dr. Patel, a postdoc with an easy smile and an even easier laugh, leaned toward her. What's your presentation on tomorrow? Oh, Carolyn fumbled, heat creeping up her neck. Cellular regeneration in marine organisms. Specifically, the mechanisms that allow starfish to regrow limbs. Dr. Patel's eyebrows shot up. Impressive. First time presenting? She nodded. Yes, and it's a little intimidating. That's normal. You'll do great, he said, raising his glass. Here's to breakthroughs. Carolyn smiled faintly as the others clinked glasses. When a server approached with a tray of drinks, Patel nudged her. You should try the white wine. It's not bad. Carolyn hesitated, then nodded. Just one, she said softly. The wine was cool and tart on her tongue, a surprising contrast to the warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't unpleasant. While the conversation engulfed her, Carolyn stayed in the background, observing the relaxed demeanor of everyone around her. She wondered if she could ever look so confident, so sure of herself. A second glass of wine appeared in her hand, and the voices around her became softer, the edges of her thoughts fuzzier. When they finally called it a night, Carolyn felt a pleasant haze settled over her. She followed the others out of the restaurant, their laughter and camaraderie filling the crisp night air. By the time she reached her hotel room, her legs were unsteady, and the weight of the day pulled her toward the bed. The keycard beeped, and she stumbled inside, forgetting to lock the door behind her. Seattle shimmered through the window, oblivious to the small-town girl finding her place amidst its chaos. Carolyn sank onto the bed, unaware of the door she'd left ajar, or the collision of two very different worlds about to take place. The hotel hallway was quiet, its polished floors gleaming under dim lighting. Carolyn's shoes scuffed softly as she walked, one hand skimming the wall for balance. Her head felt heavy, the wine dulling her edges and softening her focus. The numbers on the door plates blurred as she passed them, but room 1542 eventually came into view. She fumbled with her keycard, the green light blinking as she leaned against the door. Inside, the room was a haven of stillness. She barely managed to close the door behind her, the latch clicking softly, but never fully engaging. Tossing her purse onto the chair by the window, she kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the bed, her breathing shallow as the city lights painted faint patterns on the ceiling. Austin Woodward strode into the elevator, his tie loosened but still neat, his brow furrowed with the residue of an exhausting day. The business dinner had dragged on longer than expected. Polite conversations morphing into strategic negotiations under the guise of camaraderie. His temples throbbed faintly from the strain of playing host, but he maintained his composure as the elevator ascended. His thoughts swirled. Contracts, deadlines, faces blurred together in a tableau of power and posturing. When the doors opened, he stepped out, his hand already reaching for his keycard. Room 1542, the number etched in his memory. His room. The hallway stretched long and quiet. His polished shoes clicked softly against the carpeted floor as he approached the door. The keycard slid in smoothly. The light blinked green. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the air was warmer than he expected, carrying the faintest trace of lavender. He stepped inside, his hand moving to the light switch. It was then that he noticed the figure on the bed. Carolyn stirred at the sound of the door, her senses too hazy to immediately process the intrusion. She sat up slowly, blinking against the dim light. A tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, the faint glow from the hallway casting sharp edges onto his tailored suit. "Who are you?" She managed, her voice cracking slightly, her pulse quickening as reality clawed through the fog of wine. Austin froze. His eyes adjusted quickly to the low light, landing on the young woman sitting upright on what he was sure was his bed. "I think you're in the wrong room," he said, his voice measured but laced with confusion. "No," Carolyn whispered, her mind racing. "This is room 1542, my room." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick and disorienting. Austin glanced at the card in his hand, his brow furrowing as realization struck. The right number, but not his room. The mistake felt foreign, almost absurd, to someone so precise. He began, his voice faltering as he stepped back toward the door. The movement stirred something in Carolyn, a swell of unease mixing with embarrassment. Her hands clutched the edge of the blanket instinctively, drawing it closer. "Wait," she said, her tone sharper than intended. "How did you even get in?" Austin gestured to the open door, his expression a mix of regret and irritation. "The door wasn't locked. My mistake. I thought this was my room." Carolyn's cheeks flushed with a rush of heat. She remembered fumbling with the lock earlier, distracted and unsteady. Her mortification deepened as she realized the scene she must have presented, tipsy, disheveled, and now confronted by a stranger who looked entirely out of place in his calm authority. "You should go," she said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could think them through. "Yes," Austin replied, stepping toward the door but hesitating. His gaze flicked to her face, noting her unease and the vulnerable way she gripped the blanket. "I'm sorry," he added, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. Before he could leave, the door swung slightly on its hinges, revealing his keycard still in hand. The faint sound of footsteps outside the room drew both their attention, a reminder of the world beyond this surreal moment. He stepped back inside instinctively, closing the door behind him. "Wait, what are you doing?" Carolyn asked, her voice rising slightly. "Giving us a moment of privacy," Austin said firmly, his tone professional but firm. "It's clear this was a mistake. Let me make sure there are no misunderstandings." His presence, though unwelcome, was steady. Carolyn's chest tightened as her unease shifted into something more complex, an odd mix of frustration and gratitude. She glanced toward the door, her mind struggling to piece together the right response. The air between them crackled with tension, an unspoken weight settling as they stood on opposite sides of the room. Austin cleared his throat, his gaze meeting hers again. "I'll leave as soon as you feel safe," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I just need you to know, this was an accident." Carolyn nodded, the knot in her throat loosening slightly. "Fine," she muttered, her grip on the blanket relaxing as exhaustion began to pull her down once more. "Just don't stay too long." Austin leaned against the door, his posture controlled, but his thoughts unsettled. The room seemed smaller now, the boundaries of propriety stretching thin. For a moment, they shared the silence, neither fully understanding the gravity of the night, yet sensing its weight. The first thing Carolyn registered was the sharp intrusion of sunlight slicing through the thin curtains. She blinked against it, her head pounding faintly, her limbs heavy. For a brief, blissful second, she thought she was still home in Leavenworth, waking up to the muffled quiet of pine trees and morning birdsong. Then the sterile hum of the hotel air conditioning cut through the illusion. Her body ached. The sheets tangled around her legs felt foreign, too smooth. Slowly, the events of the previous night seeped back in, fragmented and surreal. She sat up abruptly, the room spinning slightly as she steadied herself on the mattress. That was when she noticed the man. The sound of movement snapped her fully awake. She turned her head sharply, her heart skipping at the sight of the man sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her. His shirt was unbuttoned, the stark white fabric hanging loosely over his shoulders. His posture was rigid, one hand running through his dark hair as if trying to tame the chaos within. "Good. You're awake." His voice was low, almost hesitant. Carolyn's throat went dry. She sat up too quickly, clutching the sheet to her chest as the room spun for a brief moment. What are you doing here?" Austin turned slightly, his face drawn and pale. The sight of him jolted her memory. Their presence last night, the unsteady exchange of words, the door left unlocked. He began, but his words faltered. His gaze flicked downward, and Carolyn followed his line of sight. The sheets. A faint, unmistakable stain of red marred the pristine white fabric. Her breath hitched. Heat surged to her face, burning with mortification as her mind connected the pieces. Her fingers clutched the sheets tighter, the thin fabric suddenly feeling woefully inadequate. Austin stood abruptly, his hands flexing at his sides. His face hardened with a mixture of guilt and something she couldn't quite place. "I didn't realize." He trailed off, his voice almost a whisper. Carolyn shook her head, attempting to collect her thoughts and find a stable ground amidst the chaos of embarrassment and confusion. This can't," she stammered, her voice cracking. "I need to go." She scrambled out of bed, keeping the sheet wrapped tightly around her as if it could shield her from the weight of his gaze. Her dress was a crumpled mess on the chair, and she fumbled to grab it, avoiding his eyes. "Wait," Austin said, his tone firm but not unkind. He stepped forward, but Carolyn's sharp intake of breath stopped him. He raised his hands, palms out, in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not going to hurt you. Her voice was barely audible as she turned her back to him, slipping into her dress with trembling hands. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, heavy with the weight of the night before. "I need to go," she repeated, more to herself than him. "Please," Austin said, his voice softening. He moved to the desk, his movements deliberate. He retrieved a sleek black card and placed it carefully on the nightstand. "Take this. If you need anything, if you need me to help with anything, call." Carolyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to the card, but not reaching for it. "I don't need anything from you," she said quietly, though her tone lacked conviction. Austin sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know what else to say, except that I'm sorry." His words carried a sincerity that made her chest tighten. She grabbed her purse and shoes, her movements hurried and clumsy. She didn't look back as she moved toward the door, her hand trembling as it found the handle. She whispered, "Let's just forget this happened," and then stepped into the hallway. The corridor's cool air struck her with a sharp, grounding slap. Her steps echoed as she walked, each one faster than the last. Her thoughts raced, a blur of shame, confusion, and something she couldn't quite name. In the room, Austin sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the stain on the sheets. The sunlight seemed harsher now, casting unforgiving light on a moment he couldn't take back. He ran a hand down his face, his mind replaying her hurried retreat and the unspoken accusations in her trembling voice. The card remained untouched on the nightstand, a silent reminder of the fragile thread connecting them. Whatever had happened between them, he couldn't shake the weight of responsibility settling over his chest. And somewhere down the hallway, clutching her purse like a lifeline, Carolyn fought to keep her breathing steady. The card's sleek black edges burned into her memory, despite her best efforts to forget. The train screeched to a halt at Leavenworth's modest station, jostling Carolyn awake. She blinked groggily, adjusting her scarf against the early autumn chill seeping through the thin windows. The familiar silhouette of pine trees and low rooftops came into focus, their steadfast quiet offering a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind in Seattle. Her suitcase thumped as she dragged it onto the platform. She didn't stop to take in the view. This wasn't the homecoming she'd imagined. She pulled her coat tighter around her and set off down the gravel road that led to the tiny house she lived in. The silence of the town was deafening, the kind that forced you to confront your own thoughts. But it wasn't silence she feared. It was the whispers. The wind in Leavenworth had a familiar bite, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Carolyn stood on the edge of her porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if the crisp morning air could cleanse the weight she carried since returning home. Her modest two-bedroom house sat at the end of a quiet gravel road, tucked away from the prying eyes of neighbors. Yet, she couldn't escape their whispers. The rumors had started the moment she arrived back from Seattle. Unmarried, quiet, a little too pretty for her own good. Their judgment fell like stones into the still pond of her life. Rippling out into the stairs, the murmured comments in the aisles of the local grocery store. Back from the city so soon? Mrs. Harper had asked with thinly veiled curiosity just yesterday, her lips pursed in mock concern. Didn't take long, did it? Carolyn had managed a polite smile, but the shame had followed her home, clinging to her like the scent of pine sap. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. She dropped her bag on the counter, her movements listless. It had been weeks since that night in Seattle, yet it haunted her every step. The confusion, the vulnerability, Austin's face, etched with guilt, and something deeper, remained vivid in her memory. It wasn't until her body betrayed her that the full weight of the night settled in. It started with a faint nausea, then a persistent fatigue. When her period didn't arrive, denial kept her tethered, but only for so long. Now, the unopened pregnancy test sat on the bathroom sink, glaring at her like an unwelcome guest. Carolyn stared at it, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She didn't need to open it to know the truth. Every symptom screamed confirmation, yet part of her clung to the hope that it could all be explained away. A virus, stress, anything but this. Her knees felt weak as she sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her head in her hands. The test remained untouched, a silent accusation of her own recklessness. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her spiral. She glanced at it. A message from Abby, the only person in town who hadn't cast judgment on her since her return. "Let me know if you want to talk. I'm here for you." Carolyn swallowed hard. Abby meant well, but there were some things even she couldn't share. Not now. The days bled into each other, the monotony of small-town life offering little distraction. The nausea worsened, and Carolyn found herself clutching her stomach during the long afternoons, her breaths shallow as she willed herself to push through the pain. She avoided the town square when she could, knowing the looks and murmurs waiting for her there. On one particularly restless night, she found herself pacing her living room, the floorboards creaking beneath her bare feet. The placard sat on the coffee table, its sleek surface catching the light of the small lamp beside it. She hadn't touched it since slipping it into her purse that morning in Seattle. Now, it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of her decision. Her pride screamed at her to leave it untouched, to handle this on her own. But the thought of carrying this alone, of bringing a child into the world without answers, without support, it was too much. Her fingers hovered over the card, trembling slightly before picking it up. The numbers were etched in silver, precise and unyielding, much like the man who had given it to her. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the dial button. Would he even care? Was he the type of man who would turn his back on responsibility, or had his apology been genuine? With a deep breath, she pressed the call button and held the phone to her ear. The sound of each ring pierced the fragile shield she had constructed around herself. Just as she was about to hang up, a voice broke through the static. "Austin Woodward." His tone was sharp, professional, a businessman answering yet another call. But there was a pause, a flicker of recognition. "Carolyn." Her breath caught, her voice faltering. "Yes, it's me." A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, his voice softer than she expected. She bit her lip, her hand gripping the armrest of the couch. I need to talk to you. It's important." Another pause, then the faint sound of movement on his end. "Tell me where you are. I'll come to you." The simple words held a weight that caused Carolyn's eyes to sting. For the first time in weeks, the knot in her chest loosened slightly. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but for now, she had no choice. She whispered, "I'm in Leavenworth." "I'll be there tomorrow," Austin replied, his tone resolute. As the call ended, Carolyn sat in the dim light of her living room, the card still clutched in her hand. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she felt the faintest flicker of hope amid the storm. The sleek black car rolled to a stop in front of Carolyn's modest house. Austin Woodward stepped out, his sharp suit oddly out of place against the rugged backdrop of Leavenworth's pine-lined streets and gravel paths. The wind tugged at his coat, and for a moment, he stood still, taking in the weathered facade of Carolyn's home. His jaw tightened as he noticed the peeling paint on the shutters, the uneven step leading to the porch. The town was quiet, its streets sparse save for a few curious faces peeking from behind lace curtains. Austin had felt their stares the moment he arrived, their scrutiny heavy with suspicion. He straightened his shoulders and approached the front door, rapping his knuckles firmly, but without aggression. Inside, Carolyn froze. She had been pacing for hours, her anxiety building with each tick of the clock. The sound of his knock sent a jolt through her, but she forced herself to take steady breaths. When she opened the door, her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Carolyn," Austin said softly, his expression unreadable, but his gaze steady. "Come in," she replied, stepping aside. Her voice wavered, and she hated herself for it. The sight of him, a figure of authority and calm amidst her chaos, was both comforting and unnerving. The inside of the house was warm, but sparse, its furnishings simple and functional. The faint scent of lavender lingered, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in Carolyn's mind. Austin was seated at the small kitchen table, his tall frame making the chair seem inadequate. "You didn't have to come all this way," Carolyn began, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Austin's brow furrowed, his tone firm. "You said it was important, and judging by the look on your face, I'd say it is." Carolyn sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Finally, she whispered, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Austin didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened briefly. "How far along?" he asked, his tone calm but purposeful. "Almost 2 months," she replied, her eyes darting to the table, as if it could offer her refuge from his piercing gaze. Austin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And you've been handling this on your own?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it carried an edge of concern that surprised her. "What else was I supposed to do?" Carolyn shot back, her voice cracking. "I don't even know you, and I certainly didn't plan for this." His expression softened, though his resolve didn't waver. "I understand that, but now that I know, I want to help." Carolyn shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't need charity. I can manage on my own." "This isn't about charity," Austin said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's about ensuring you and the baby are safe. Look around, Carolyn. Is this really the best place for you to handle this?" His words stung because they held truth. She had tried to ignore the cracks in her walls, the whispers of her neighbors, the relentless nausea that left her too weak to even shop for groceries some days. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I'm not saying you can't handle it," Austin continued, his tone softening. "But you shouldn't have to do it alone. Come back to Seattle with me. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Carolyn stared at him, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to scream at him for assuming she needed saving. Another part of her, the part that had spent sleepless nights worrying about the future, was tempted to accept. "Why do you care?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Austin's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. "Because this is my responsibility too, and because I know what it's like to feel alone in the face of something bigger than yourself." She was taken aback by the genuineness of his words. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant it. Carolyn exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping. "I'll go," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "But only because it's what's best for the baby. Not for me." A flicker of relief crossed Austin's face, but he nodded solemnly. "That's all I'm asking." As he stood to leave, Carolyn watched him, still unsure if she could trust the man standing in her kitchen. But for now, she had no choice but to take the step forward. As the door closed behind him, Carolyn felt the faintest shift in the air, as if her world had tilted slightly towards something new, something uncertain but inevitable. "How was your day? Was there anything particularly stressful or uplifting? If this story helped you in any way or gave you some energy, please leave a mango in the comments below." Carolyn stood at the threshold of Austin's mansion, her breath catching as she took in the sprawling estate. The house loomed over her, all sharp lines and glass panels that reflected the vast gardens surrounding it. The driveway, paved with smooth stone, curved gracefully toward a fountain in the center, its soft burble the only sound breaking the stillness. "This way," Austin said, his tone calm but clipped, as if he sensed her hesitation. He placed a hand on her suitcase, guiding her through the grand double doors. The interior was no less imposing. Polished floors stretched endlessly under high ceilings, adorned with intricate chandeliers. The air smelled faintly of cedar and citrus, a scent so curated and pristine it felt almost unnatural. Carolyn's fingers brushed the strap of her bag, as if anchoring herself to something familiar amidst the opulence. A middle-aged woman in a crisp black uniform approached, her expression neutral but professional. "This is Mrs. Cooper," Austin introduced. "She'll make sure you have everything you need." "Thank you," Carolyn murmured, her voice barely audible. She felt small, not just physically, but emotionally, like a misplaced puzzle piece in a picture too grand for her modest edges. Her days at the estate were strangely quiet. Carolyn had been given a sunlit room overlooking the garden, its walls painted in soft creams and blues. The bed was far too large, its pillows fluffed to perfection, and the desk by the window remained untouched, despite her attempts to settle back into her research. Mornings were spent in the library or walking the gardens, trying to find a rhythm to her new life. She would occasionally cross paths with Austin, their conversations polite but distant. He seemed busy, constantly in motion, fielding phone calls, heading out for meetings, or reviewing documents in his study. But the evenings were different. Austin, in an effort to make her feel included, began inviting her to social events. The first was a dinner with his business partners. Carolyn had reluctantly agwoodwood, the thought of declining seeming ungrateful. The dining room was a cacophony of laughter and polished conversation. The women wore sleek gowns, their jewels glittering under the soft light, while the men exchanged stories of mergers and stock gains. Carolyn, in her simple dress, felt the weight of their gazes, the subtle flick of eyes that judged her, the polite smiles that failed to hide their curiosity. "Austin," a woman said, her voice dripping with practiced charm, You never told us you had a guest." "This is Carolyn," he replied, his tone even but firm. "She's working on some groundbreaking research." "Oh?" the woman said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "How interesting." The conversations that followed were thinly veiled attempts to probe her presence, where she was from, how she knew Austin, why she was here. Each question felt like a small dagger, prying at her vulnerabilities. By the end of the night, Carolyn's nerves were frayed, her chest tight with humiliation. Later that evening, back in the quiet of the estate, Carolyn sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she removed her earrings. The tears she had held back all evening spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands, the weight of the night pressing down on her. A soft knock on the door startled her. She wiped her cheeks quickly as Austin stepped inside, his expression unusually somber. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "No," Carolyn admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't belong here. I don't belong in your world." Austin moved to sit in the chair by the window, his posture relaxed, but his eyes serious. "You're right. My world can be ruthless, and tonight, that wasn't fair to you." Carolyn exhaled shakily, her gaze fixed on her hands. "It's not just tonight," she said quietly. "It's everything. My past. My stepfather." She trailed off, her words catching in her throat. Austin's expression darkened. "What about your stepfather?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated, but the words spilled out anyway. "He used to touch me. I was just a kid. My mother never believed me." Her voice broke, and she closed her eyes tightly. "I've spent my whole life trying to avoid being in situations where I feel powerless." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession settling between them. Austin leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. His jaw was clenched, his eyes blazing with quiet fury. Not at her, but at the man who had hurt her. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice raw. "No one should have to go through that. Ever." Carolyn looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his gaze. For the first time, she saw something more than formality in him. Something protective, something human. The next morning, Carolyn woke to find a newspaper folded neatly on the kitchen counter. The headline caught her eye. "Woodward Foundation announces new initiative to combat childhood abuse." Her breath caught as she skimmed the article. Austin had acted swiftly, turning his quiet rage into something tangible. He hadn't mentioned it to her, but she understood. It was his way of telling her she wasn't alone. For the first time since arriving, Carolyn felt a flicker of something she hadn't dared to hope for. Trust. The Foundation announcement cast a long shadow over the following days, its impact rippling through Carolyn's thoughts like an unexpected current. She found herself lingering over the article longer than she intended, her fingers tracing the bold headline as if it could somehow steady the whirlwind inside her. Austin had not spoken about it since, but his actions conveyed a message more powerful than any words could. On the third morning after the announcement, Carolyn was in the garden, absently weeding the flower beds, while sunlight dappled the ground through the trees. Her fingers worked the soil, grounding her in its cool, earthy texture. The quiet was her solace, her way of untangling the threads of doubt and gratitude that now defined her days. "Do you always work this hard, or are you trying to avoid me?" Austin's voice broke the stillness. She glanced up sharply, her hand freezing mid-motion. He stood at the edge of the path, hands in his pockets, his stance casual, but his expression probing. "I wasn't avoiding you," she replied, though the heat creeping up her neck betrayed her. "Gardening helps me think." Austin stepped closer, his polished shoes incongruous against the rustic path. "You've been quiet since the announcement," he said, his tone gentle. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it." Carolyn reclined on her heels and wiped her hands on her jeans. "It surprised me," she admitted. "But it means a lot. What you did." His gaze softened, and for a moment, the formidable businessman was replaced by someone more vulnerable, someone searching for connection. "It was the least I could do," he said. "Hearing your story, it stayed with me. I wanted to do something that mattered." Carolyn's chest tightened, but she nodded, letting the silence between them settle into something almost comfortable. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Carolyn found herself seated in the library with Austin. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth filling the space. She was curled up in one corner of the leather couch, a book resting on her lap, while Austin sat across from her, scanning through a file of documents. "I don't think I ever asked," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "What made you choose marine biology?" Carolyn looked up, surprised by the question. His tone wasn't idle, it carried genuine curiosity. She hesitated, then placed the book down. "When I was a kid, my mum used to take me to this tiny aquarium in the city," she began. "It wasn't much, just a few tanks and a touch pool. But I loved it. There was something magical about the ocean, how vast and mysterious it was." A faint smile tugged at her lips, and Austin watched her with quiet attention. "I used to think if I studied hard enough, I could understand it all," she continued. "But the more I learned, the more I realized how much there was left to discover. That's what keeps me going. The mystery." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced at him, self-conscious. "Sorry, that probably sounds ridiculous." "It doesn't," Austin said, his voice steady. "It sounds like passion, and it's rare to see someone so driven by something that pure." Carolyn blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. "What about you?" she asked cautiously. "What drives you?" Austin leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the fire. "I used to think it was ambition," he said after a pause. "Building something that lasted, proving I could do it. But lately—" He exhaled, his expression shadowed. "Lately it feels like I'm chasing something I don't even recognize anymore." His admission lingered in the air, raw and unexpected. Carolyn studied him, her usual wariness softening. "Maybe you just need to stop chasing," she said quietly, "and start looking around." The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, a rare and fleeting smile. "Maybe," he murmured, his eyes meeting hers with an openness she hadn't seen before. In the days that followed, their conversations grew longer, their silences less guarded. Austin began joining Carolyn on her morning walks through the garden, their exchanges shifting from polite pleasantries to genuine dialogue. He listened when she spoke about her research, asking questions that showed he wasn't just humoring her. And Carolyn, in turn, found herself asking about his work, curious about the man behind the empire. One evening, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, Carolyn turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Why are you doing all this? The foundation, the walks, the conversations." "Me?" Austin looked at her, his expression steady. "Because I care," he said simply. "About you, about the baby, and because I think you deserve to know that not everyone will fail you." His words struck her with a profound honesty. For so long, she had kept herself locked away, convinced that trust was a weakness. But in that moment, with Austin standing beside her, his actions and words aligning in a way that felt undeniable, she allowed herself to believe, or at least in the 6th month of pregnancy, she should be that positive. It began with whispers in the next 2 months, a blog post on a niche gossip site, vague and poorly written, speculating about Austin Woodward's sudden interest in a mysterious woman. Then came the grainy photographs. Carolyn, stepping out of Austin's car, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. Within hours, the story exploded across social media and tabloids. "Small-town girl traps billionaire CEO," screamed one headline. Another read, "Rural gold digger snags Woodward Empire heir." Carolyn froze when she saw it, the glossy tabloid shoved under her door by someone who clearly wanted her to read it. The grainy photo of her, taken without consent, burned in her vision. Her hand trembled as she dropped the paper onto the kitchen counter, bile rising in her throat. The first phone call came minutes later. Abby, her only friend from Leavenworth, frantic and apologetic. "Carolyn, I didn't want to call, but people are saying horrible things. They're talking about you like they know you." Carolyn's knees buckled, and she sank into the nearest chair. "I can't deal with this," she whispered, more to herself than Abby. Austin had been on a call when his assistant stormed into his office, pale and hesitant. "You need to see this," she said, sliding a tablet across his desk. The articles were relentless, twisting truths and fabricating lies. Each accusation built a narrative of betrayal, deceit, and Woodward. Austin stared at the screen, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the magnitude of the smear campaign. His immediate concern wasn't his reputation. It was Carolyn. When Austin arrived at the estate that evening, he found Carolyn in the library, curled up in the farthest corner. Her face was pale, and her hands clutched a blanket, as if it could shield her from the weight of the world outside. "They're saying awful things," she whispered, not looking up as he entered. "About me. About us. About the baby." Austin's heart clenched. He had seen her face many emotions in the past months, but never this. This fragile, bone-deep defeat. "Carolyn, listen to me," he said, crouching in front of her. "None of what they're saying matters. None of it is true." Her head lifted, her eyes wet and red-rimmed. "It doesn't matter if it's true. People will believe it. They always believe the worst." Before he could respond, Carolyn doubled over, her hands clutching her abdomen. A sharp, panicked cry escaped her lips. "The baby! Something's wrong!" Austin didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, barking for the driver as he carried her out to the waiting car. The ride to the hospital was a blur of Carolyn's shallow breaths and Austin's urgent commands to move faster. The sterile brightness of the hospital room was a stark contrast to the chaos that had brought them there. Carolyn lay on the bed, her face pale and damp with sweat, her breaths shallow but steady. A doctor hovered over her, murmuring reassurances while a nurse checked her vitals. "It's premature labor," the doctor said to Austin, his voice low. "Stress-induced. We'll do everything we can to stabilize her and the babies." Austin nodded, his throat tight. He stepped aside as they worked, his gaze fixed on Carolyn's face, which was etched with pain and fear. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. Hours later, Carolyn was stabilized, though she remained weak. Austin sat at her bedside, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When her eyes fluttered open, he leaned forward, relief washing over him. "The babies," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "They're okay," he assured her. "You're okay. That's all that matters." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly turned her head away. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't bring them into a world where people already hate us." Austin's jaw tightened, his heart breaking at her words. He reached for her hand, his touch firm but gentle. "Carolyn, look at me." She turned back to him reluctantly, her eyes searching his. "I don't care what the world says. none of it changes the truth. You're not alone in this. I'm here, and I'll protect you and our children, no matter what it takes." His words carried a conviction that silenced her doubts, if only for a moment. The next day, Austin made good on his promise. At a press conference held in the Woodward Corporation's glass-walled headquarters, he stood before a sea of reporters, his expression unyielding. "The stories circulating about Miss Evans are not only false, but deeply harmful," he began, his voice steady. "Carolyn is an intelligent, resilient woman who has faced challenges most of us couldn't imagine. She is not a gold digger. She is not a schemer. She is the mother of my children, and she deserves respect." His statement reverberated across media outlets, transforming the narrative. While the whispers didn't disappear entirely, the backlash softened, and a tide of support began to rise. In the quiet of the hospital room that evening, Austin returned to Carolyn's side. Her expression was still weary, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Trust. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, taking her hand. "Because you're not alone in this, Carolyn. Not anymore." The soft cries of newborns broke the stillness of the hospital room, drawing Carolyn out of the haze of exhaustion. She turned her head slowly, her eyes landing on the small, swaddled bundles resting in the clear bassinet beside her bed. Her heart swelled and tightened all at once. "They're perfect," came Austin's voice, low and steady, as he stepped into view. He stood over the twins, his broad shoulders tense, as if afraid to disturb them. The guarded lines of his face softened as he reached down to adjust the blanket covering the smaller of the two boys. Carolyn whispered, "Logan and Lucas," the names flowing effortlessly from her lips like a prayer. Austin glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Logan's the loud one," he said, nodding toward the baby, whose cries had momentarily filled the room. "Lucas is quieter. He just watches everything." Carolyn tried to sit up, wincing as her body protested. Immediately, Austin was at her side, his hands gentle but firm as he helped her adjust the bed. "Careful," he said, his voice laced with concern. "You're still recovering." "I'm fine," she insisted, though the fatigue in her voice betrayed her. "I need to hold them." Austin hesitated, his protective instincts warring with her determination. Finally, he nodded, carefully lifting Lucas and placing him in her arms. The weight of her son, warm and impossibly small, brought tears to her eyes. "He's so tiny," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can someone so small feel this enormous?" Austin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat beside her, his gaze fixed on Lucas. "Because they change everything," he said softly. "In the best way." Over the next few days, the hospital room became their entire world. Nurses arrived and departed, providing silent comfort and monitoring the twins' development. Logan and Lucas were healthy, though their premature size required constant monitoring. Carolyn found herself marveling at every tiny movement, the way their fingers curled, the softness of their breaths, the strength of their cries. Austin rarely left her side. He seemed almost enchanted by the babies, his usual composed demeanor giving way to a tenderness Carolyn hadn't seen before. He changed diapers with surprising efficiency, cradled the boys with practiced ease, and even sang to them in a low, gravelly voice that made Carolyn's chest ache. One afternoon, as Logan fussed in his arms, Austin paced the room, gently bouncing him. "It's okay, little man," he murmured. "I've got you." Carolyn watched from her bed, her heart caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. This was the same man who once seemed so untouchable, so distant. Yet here he was, completely at ease, his focus entirely on their child. "You're good at this," she said softly, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. Austin glanced at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before it softened. "I didn't think I would be," he admitted. "But they make it easier." Carolyn smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of Lucas's blanket. "I didn't think I'd ever feel ready for this," she confessed. "But now, I can't imagine anything else." As the days went by, Carolyn started to perceive Austin differently. He wasn't just the stoic businessman she had met months ago. He was patient, gentle, and fiercely protective. He doted on the twins with an intensity that surprised her, yet he also gave her space to find her own footing as a mother. One evening, as the babies slept in their bassinets, Austin sat beside her on the couch in their temporary hospital suite. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of monitors and the occasional rustle of blankets. "You've changed," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. Austin turned to her, his brow lifting slightly. "Have I?" "Yes," she said firmly. "You're softer, more open." He leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the twins. "They've changed me," he admitted. "You've changed me." Carolyn's breath caught at his words. She studied his face, noting the vulnerability in his expression. "I never thought you'd care about this. About us." Austin met her eyes, his voice steady. "I didn't expect it either. But I do. More than I can explain." His words hovered between them, raw and unguarded. For the first time, Carolyn allowed herself to believe that his feelings weren't just obligation or responsibility. They were genuine. When they finally brought the twins home, the estate felt different, warmer. Logan and Lucas became the heart of their days, their presence filling the once quiet rooms with laughter and life. Carolyn found herself leaning on Austin more than she expected. He was there for every sleepless night, every first milestone, and every quiet moment when the enormity of parenthood threatened to overwhelm her. Slowly, she began to trust him, not just as a father, but as a partner. One evening, as the twins slept in their nursery, Austin found her in the garden, her favorite retreat. The moonlight cast a soft glow over her face, and for a moment, he simply watched her. "Thank you," she said quietly, sensing his presence. "For what?" he asked, stepping closer. "For being here," she replied. "For being you." Austin reached for her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "You're not alone, Carolyn," he said, his voice steady. "You never will be." For the first time in what felt like forever, she believed him. The soft hum of the hospital room was broken only by the steady breathing of Logan and Lucas. Carolyn cradled Logan, his tiny hand clutching the edge of her shirt, while Lucas lay peacefully in the bassinet beside her. The world beyond these walls felt distant, irrelevant. Her focus was entirely on the two fragile lives she had brought into the world, and the man who had stayed steadfastly by her side. Austin entered the room quietly, his presence as steady as ever. He carried a tray with a steaming cup of tea and set it on the small table beside her bed. "You should drink this," he said, his voice soft. "You've barely eaten all day." Carolyn glanced up at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you." He returned her smile briefly before his gaze settled on Logan. "He looks like you," Austin said, a rare tenderness in his voice. "Does he?" Carolyn whispered, glancing down at the sleeping baby in her arms. She hadn't thought about it, too consumed with their survival to notice anything beyond their tiny breaths and fluttering movements. "And Lucas," Austin continued, leaning over the bassinet to adjust the blanket. "He has your quiet strength." Carolyn's heart tightened at his words. There was something in his tone, a weight that hinted at emotions he wasn't ready to say outright. She watched as he knelt beside her, his broad shoulders folding as he rested his hands on the bed. "Carolyn," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through, everything you've been through." She tilted her head, her brows furrowing slightly. "Austin, you don't have to—" "Let me finish," he interrupted gently, his gaze locking onto hers. "I've spent so much of my life focused on what I could build, what I could control. But these past months, you and the boys have shown me something I never realized I was missing." Carolyn's breath caught as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her heartbeat quickened, her eyes darting between the box and his face. "This isn't about obligation," he said firmly. "This isn't about responsibility. It's about love, Carolyn. I love you. I love the strength you've shown, the way you've cared for our children, and the way you've changed me without even trying." Her eyes filled with tears as he opened the box, revealing a delicate ring that shimmered in the dim light. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you," he continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his expression. "Not because we have children together, but because I can't imagine a life without you. Will you marry me?" The weight of his words settled over her, leaving her momentarily speechless. Carolyn looked down at Logan, his tiny face relaxed in sleep, then at Lucas, his quiet, breathing a reassurance that everything they had fought for was worth it. Finally, her gaze returned to Austin, who knelt before her, his heart laid bare. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, I'll marry you." Austin's shoulders relaxed, a rare smile breaking across his face. He took her free hand, slipping the ring onto her finger with a reverence that made her chest ache. As he stood, Logan stirred in her arms, letting out a soft whimper. Austin leaned down, brushing a kiss against the baby's forehead before placing a gentle hand on Carolyn's cheek. "We're a family now," he said softly, "and nothing will change that." Carolyn nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she leaned into his touch. For the first time in months, the uncertainty that had shadowed her every step lifted, replaced by a hope she hadn't dared to believe in. That night, as the twins slept peacefully in their bassinets, Carolyn and Austin sat side by side on the narrow hospital bed. The ring on her finger caught the moonlight streaming through the window, a quiet symbol of the new beginning they had forged together. The future still felt daunting, but for the first time, Carolyn wasn't afraid. She had Austin by her side, not as a protector or a benefactor, but as her partner. And as she rested her head against his shoulder, watching over their sons, she knew they would face whatever came next together. A family, a forever. The days leading up to the charity gala were a whirlwind. The twins, Logan and Lucas, kept Carolyn and Austin on their toes, but amidst the sleepless nights and endless diaper changes, there was a growing sense of calm, a rhythm to their life that felt almost natural. Carolyn found herself settling into the role of mother and fiancée with surprising ease, though the thought of stepping into Austin's world still filled her with trepidation. The gala was Austin's idea, a way to formally introduce Carolyn as not just his partner, but as the driving force behind their new foundation. She had hesitated at first, uncertain if she was ready to face the scrutiny of high society, but Austin had been unwavering. "They need to see you for who you truly are," he had said, his voice steady, not the version the tabloids created. The Woodward estate was bustling with activity on the night of the gala. Stylists, coordinators, and assistants moved through the halls with purpose, ensuring every detail was perfect. Carolyn stood in front of a full-length mirror in her suite, her hands smoothing over the flowing emerald gown that clung to her frame in all the right places. "You look stunning," Austin said from the doorway, his eyes taking her in with an admiration that made her cheeks flush. "I feel like an imposter," she admitted, turning to face him. "This isn't my world." "It is now," he said, stepping closer. He reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "And you're not alone in it." His words settled the nerves buzzing in her chest. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." The gala was held in the grand ballroom of a historic hotel in downtown Seattle. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, and the air buzzed with polite laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Carolyn felt the weight of every gaze as they entered, Austin's hand resting lightly on her lower back. Whispers followed them, but Austin's presence beside her was a shield, his confidence bolstering her own. As they moved through the room, she caught snippets of conversation, some curious, others skeptical, but there was a noticeable shift in tone when Austin introduced her. "This is Carolyn Evans," he said, his voice carrying a quiet pride. "My fiancée and the inspiration behind the Woodward Foundation's newest initiative." Her heart skipped at the word fiancée, and she found herself standing a little taller, meeting each gaze with quiet confidence. The questions came quickly, but this time she was ready. She spoke about the Foundation's mission, her own experiences, and the importance of protecting vulnerable children. The more she spoke, the more the initial skepticism in the room gave way to genuine respect. As the evening progressed, Carolyn effortlessly interacted with others, as the initial tension gradually transformed into a surprising sense of belonging. Austin remained near, his steady presence providing constant reassurance, yet he allowed her to take the lead, stepping back to allow her to shine. Toward the end of the night, Austin took the stage. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice commanding yet warm. "Tonight, we celebrate not just the launch of the Woodward Foundation's newest initiative, but the resilience and strength of those who inspire us to do better," he said, his gaze drifting to Carolyn. "Carolyn has taught me that change starts with compassion and courage. She has not only changed my life, but given me a purpose far beyond what I could have imagined." The applause was thunderous, and Carolyn felt a lump rise in her throat. She blinked back tears as Austin stepped down, returning to her side. He took her hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're amazing," he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "So are you," she whispered back, her heart full. Later that evening, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the city, Carolyn leaned against the balustrade, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Austin stood beside her, his arm draped around her shoulders. "You handled tonight beautifully," he said, his tone filled with admiration. "It wasn't as terrifying as I thought it would be," she admitted, glancing up at him. "I think I even enjoyed it." "That's because you belong here," he said, his gaze unwavering. "With me. With our boys. This is your world now, Carolyn, and you're making it better every day." She rested her head against his shoulder, a soft smile playing on her lips. For the first time, she truly believed him. The doubts and insecurities that had once defined her felt distant, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she wasn't alone. As the lights of the city twinkled below them, Carolyn felt a deep sense of peace. She and Austin had faced the world together tonight, and they had emerged stronger. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer felt daunting. Together, they were unstoppable. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.